It's time for Forward Nation Radio. Now here he is, the host of Forward Nation Radio, David Leventhal.
Fake news would tell you that we don't care for Jews. I tell you all this because I've seen it all, so I just want to set the record straight while they're here. One of our attorneys is a Jew.
Hello, Forward Nation Radio viewers. We'd like to start off today with the statement. Fake news will tell you that I don't care for Republicans. That is not true. I have Republican friends. Sometimes they invite me to their country clubs even. And when there's a mass shooting, I frequently call up one of my Republican friends and say, tell me about the gun that was used. I have a Republican lawyer. When you're looking for a shyster, you want to go to the Republicans. My tax accountant, also a Republican. When you're trying to avoid taxes, again, you pretty much want to go with the Republican, if you know what I mean. Did you hear that in Britain, a baby was born with a heart outside of its body? And doctors successfully put it back in, and the baby is alive and doing fine. I like Republicans. I think this is probably voter fraud. They shouldn't have put the heart back in. Anyway, before we jump the gun on other issues, at work, we have a black janitor. The guys who cut my lawn, Hispanics. And I'm pretty sure that some of them might be undocumented because otherwise I can't imagine they work that cheap. My wedding cake, the guy who baked it, pretty sure he's a homosexual. Anyway, girl, I'm thirsty. Would you get me some water? And now our show. Welcome to Forward Nation Radio. It's been a busy week for me. So, has there been any news?
The election.
The election. Oh, the election in Alabama. How did I forget? Right, the Alabama senatorial election. That Jones guy won, right? The Democrat won that one. Wow, although to be fair, I understand that Roy Moore is continuing with his basic tactic of never conceding anything. But apparently, Doug Jones, a Democrat, has pulled off a shocking upset in Alabama, having won by enough votes that apparently the Republicans can't even really ask for a recount. In his victory speech, Doug Jones did what I guess every politician does, except for Donald Trump, certainly every Democratic politician does. He says this just shows that we could be united. This shows that we could be united? That's a wonderful thought. But it shows that we're united? What was interesting, when we talk about how united we are, is looking at the polls going into the election. I, for one, had argued for a while that Doug Jones was going to lose, and was going to probably lose by a lot, because even though the polls showed it very close, we figured that Alabama voters, when they were asked by people in person, are you going to vote for the pedophile, might have actually been reluctant to say yes. Turns out, though, the last couple of days before the election, I started thinking maybe Jones has a chance, because at that point it had become apparent that more radioactive in Alabama than being a pedophile is being a Democrat. And that as many people might have lied about voting for Roy Moore because they didn't want to say they were voting for a pedophile, probably about as many people were lying that they might vote for Doug Jones because God knows they weren't going to admit to voting for a Democrat. So we're all asking ourselves, and I'm being asked by many, what does the election mean? Well, first of all, it means that the United States Senate can once again hire female pages from high school. No, it probably still can't hire female pages from high school, but still. What about the issues? What does it mean for the issues? Apparently, for issues voters in Alabama, among people who voted for Doug Jones, people were concerned about economic opportunity and health care. High on the list, greatly top, in fact, the entire list pretty much for Roy Moore supporters was abortion. I'm not sure we're coming together on a lot of this. How do we move forward on this? Bear in mind that Mr. Jones will be one of 100 U.S. senators. And he will be representing a political party that still has a minority in the United States Senate. The Republicans will still hold a 51-49 edge. And that means they will be able to ram their agenda, continue ramming their agenda and their unqualified federal judges right down the throats of the rest of America, as long as they don't have defections. Before, they could tolerate 2 defections, and Vice President Jesus-y Jesus would be able to cast a tie-breaking vote in favor of giving more to rich people, you know, like Jesus. But now they can only lose 1. And on some bills, as we've seen, there hasn't been much margin for error. So what does this mean for current Republican senators? Well, for some of them, like Bob Corker and Jeff Flake, I think this is like winning lottery. And what I mean by that is, they can't be threatened in future elections in order to get them to toe the party line. They've already announced that they won't be running in future elections. So they have to be blackmailed or bribed with the threat of future riches or the lack thereof for them and their family. So Corker and Flake could go on the tax bill, you need my vote. It's going to cost you. And presumably, they are going to get very lucrative consulting jobs, as will their sons, their daughters, their aunts, their uncles, their cousins, etc., anybody they want, because their vote is needed now. But maybe, just maybe, on the occasional vote, Republicans, 1 or 2, will be forced to switch sides. On the tax bill, I'm once again talking to you, Susan Collins. Susan Collins, who got promises that are already being reneged on in order to fall on that side of the fence she was sitting on the tax bill. One of the arguments was, well, even if she had voted no, it wouldn't have made a difference because it would have just been a tie and then Pence would have voted for the bill anyway. Well, now, Susan Collins, if Corker remains true to his no vote, you can change the tide of the bill. So maybe instead of extracting promises, you can extract contracts for your state. Maybe you could do something for the country and vote that piece of crap down. More on the tax bill in a few minutes, but let's stick with the results of the election, which of course has been on everybody's mind. What does this mean for future elections? Well, something we've been talking about for weeks at Forward Nation Radio. Democrats need to be energized. We need to remain seriously high on some serious caffeine rush for the next year, as I'm being shown a Red Bull by my producer, who did not share it with me, by the way. My enthusiasm is self-generated. Anyway, energized Democratic voters are going to have to go out and fight for this. This was a lesson of this election. The turnout among Democratic voters was extraordinary. It needs to be extraordinary in 50 states in 2018. One of the sad facts of this particular election was that the Democrats outspent the Republicans 10-1 in Alabama to eke out this narrow victory. That will not be replicated nationwide. So what they cannot replicate with money, they're going to need to replicate with enthusiasm. And I say to all of our Democratic viewers, get your enthusiasm up, get your friends and your family members' enthusiasm up. Okay, most of us can't stay that high for a year. So you might want to wait like 10 months and then get seriously energized and make sure people are energized. But before that time, make sure your friends are registered, etc. There is a remarkable fight that we need to undertake right now for a majority of the United States Senate in 2018. Right now, by 1 vote, the Republicans can still ram their agenda and their incompetence through. If the Democrats win the Senate in 2018, it all comes to a screeching halt. Or at least it should. And at that point, we could start talking about what pussies Democrats Democrats are and how they refuse to fight dirty like the Republicans do, but let's at least get to that point. What else does it mean for future elections? Well, one of the lessons that the Republicans are going to take out of this, and it's not what you're thinking, not yet. One of the lessons Republicans are going to take out of this is we're going to have to do a better job at voter suppression over the next 10 months. They'd been doing a ton of voter suppression in Alabama. Tens of thousands of people couldn't vote in Alabama because of rules that they had enacted. But it didn't matter. The turnout was high enough that the Democrats were able to win anyway. So they're going to have to do an even better job of voter suppression. More voter ID laws will be implemented around this country, and they will be followed by policies to make sure that people in minority districts cannot actually get those voter IDs. I'm talking to you now, Wisconsin, among other states, closing motor vehicle bureaus while requiring people to get ID at motor vehicle bureaus. In case anyone thinks that this is about voter fraud, stop thinking that. GOP leaders were clear on the intent of all of their efforts in Alabama to stop people from voting. Republicans in Alabama referred to blacks in their state, black voters, as aborigines, illiterates, and talked about how they were taking housing and urban development funded buses to their polling places. Gosh, I don't know why Republicans have such a hard time getting black people to vote for them. We're going back years ago. The Supreme Court created this mess with the Shelby v. Holder decision that ended the pre-clearance requirement for states that had a long history of preventing blacks and other minorities from voting. As a result, states like Alabama immediately went out stopping blacks and other minorities from voting. That's not going to change with this Republican Supreme Court. So it better be changed in other places, like ultimately at the ballot box. Okay, so what does it mean for the Republican Party, this election? David Brooks, a Republican and a conservative, who writes for the New York Times, had an interesting op-ed this week titled, "The GOP is Rotting." Point out again that he is a Republican and a conservative. In fact, even in his article, I believe he was far more favorable of Republicans' intellectual history than most of us would be, certainly than I am. David Brooks, for instance, apparently thought making Sarah Palin the vice president of the United States wasn't such a bad idea. I don't agree with quite the intellectual past that he sees with the Republicans, but I agree with the fact that this is a rotting political party right now, as does anybody looking at this party. There was also an op-ed in the New York Times this week by an evangelical Republican titled, "I'm no longer an evangelical Republican. Don't call me that." And there was some interesting language in his op-ed, noting that he had been shaped by a Republican Party which was created to end slavery and preserve the Union. Okay, we find allies in the strangest of places. I have to point out, that was 150 plus years ago. It's not the same Republican Party. You might not have noticed. But still, the Republican Party was created 160 years ago when they were the party of Lincoln to end slavery and preserve the Union. He also points out that he was shaped by evangelicalism, an effort to faithfully represent Christ in word and deed. Obviously, they have a slightly different conception of Christ than I do. Now, I don't have much of a background, did not grow up Christian. I am married to a practicing Catholic. Many of her friends are priests and nuns, and I've had long conversations with them. And interestingly, all of them think that Jesus was more about giving to poor people and not letting rich people screw up the world. You know, the camel through the eye of a needle thing? Than they were about gays. But okay, the bottom line is, he said, we've become completely corrupted. Our party's corrupted, our religion, our evangelicalism is corrupted by the will for power. Time he wrote it, still seemed very likely that evangelicals were going to put a credibly accused pedophile into the United States Senate. Speaking of a credibly accused pedophile, Roy Moore. A homophobic, Islamophobic, sexist, racist apologist, and accused pedophile. That's Roy Moore I'm talking about, right? Not Donald Trump. I could be talking about Donald Trump, but I'm actually talking about Roy Moore right now. And that kind of is important. Because of all those awful things, the one thing we could be sure of, what irked a lot of voters in Alabama was only the last part of that, the pedophile part, which they would prefer were not the case. What do I mean by this? Well, I was happy to see some things during the election coverage. I was happy to see that a Roy Moore voter in Alabama had pointed out that he felt that people were innocent until proven guilty regarding the pedophilia issue. A noble and even liberal sentiment, which would be a little bit more gratifying if it hadn't come from somebody who probably has a Hillary for prison bumper sticker on the back of his pickup truck. Nevertheless, a nice thought, innocent till proven guilty. But what about the slavery thing? What about the racism thing? Slavery was the last great time in America? I think it was great at the time when families were united, even though we had slavery. They cared for one another. Even though we had slavery as an aside? Well, you know, it really was a hell of a play. Even though my husband got shot in the head and assassinated, still, you gotta give credit, it was very well performed. People were strong in their family. Well, you know, the anti-slavery thing, yeah, but the important thing was we had families, white families. What about his views on homosexuality? Should be illegal, should be punished, perhaps by the death penalty. We talked about sodomy last time from the Bible, and the fact that Roy Moore apparently attempted to have sodomy with a minor, and yet presumably doesn't think he should be executed. He's also pointed out that Muslims should not be allowed in Congress. Another sentiment, I'm sure, that is shared by very, very few of his voters. One thing we can be sure of course, is that Roy Moore is not an anti-Semite. According to his wife, they will be willing to pray to Jesus with Jews. Like, for instance, Jay Sekulow, the Jews for Jesus Trump lawyer. As long as the Jews are willing to pray to Jesus, they're fine. How did does anyone know how the Jewish vote ended up in Alabama? I'm not sure. I didn't see the final numbers on that. I actually can, yeah, Robbie. Yeah, how'd you vote? Yeah, and what about the missus? Uh-huh. Okay, well, it turns out the Jewish vote was split right down the middle in Alabama. 50-50. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration. In fact, 0.2% of the Alabama population was Jewish, and they probably were feeling a whole lot better after Mrs. Moore comments about her Jewish friends. Where else do we go from this vote? Chris Matthews, I saw last night, briefly, pointed out that the election was a referendum on who we are. The good news is that 51% of us rejected pedophilia, Islamophobia, racism, homophobia, whatever I just left out. Maybe the problem is, as we've been talking about on this show for a while about divisiveness, maybe the problem is that for many of us, this is who we are. And in America, when it comes to racism, bigotry, and discrimination, let's be clear, it's always been who we are. But the Republican Party is the family values party, as we know from the good old days of slavery. Family values party, I just was talking about this in one of my classes. That's why the Family Medical Leave Act was signed into law by Bill Clinton upon taking office, because it had been rejected by the two prior Republican family values presidents. Why? Because family values, Republican style, says if your mother is sick or dying, your baby is sick, go to work. So much for family values. What we are seeing, though, where family values idea came from, the split in the Republican Party. The Trump-Bannon wing of the Republican Party, which Trump is already trying to tweet his way out of, probably not understanding what the hell's going on, versus the Republican establishment. As we've noted and is evidenced in the tax bill, the Republican establishment is just about tax cuts for rich people. They just want more for rich people. But how do you win an election if all you are is about fabulously wealthy people? And the answer is you divide the rest of America through social issues. You engage in divisiveness. This is the strategy. The Republican establishment did this for a long time. They promised that they would get rid of abortions, and they delivered tax cuts to billionaires, time after time. Eventually, the Steve Bannon wing of the party got fed up with all the false promises and said, message to you, Susan Collins, and said, I expect you to deliver now. And so now you've got this split in the Republican Party. Where does it go now? The idea of getting this country less divided is that ultimately when you run the middle, the American people want to come together into something moderate. But that idea hasn't been upended for many years. This is the Karl Rove strategy that got Boy George into the presidency, which is you don't appeal to people in the middle. You don't convince people to join your side. You win by energizing your electorate. So what are we going to see now for a year? We are going to see energizing the ultra-right-wing Republican base with racism, Islamophobia, and other acts of divisiveness. I don't think it gets better after this. I think it gets a lot worse. So, speaking about coming together, we have finally achieved unity on the tax bill. Well, when I say unity, I mean that just today, the Republican negotiators from the House and the Senate apparently came up with a unified tax bill that they can now go ahead and pass. Quick, vote on it. Why? Because none of us know yet what's in it. You got to vote for it real quick, or someone might actually read it. So hurry up and pass it. Interestingly, Democrats, of course, are arguing, why are you in such a rush to pass this tax bill? Doug Jones, a newly elected senator from Alabama, takes office in January. We should wait until he takes office, right? Isn't that the argument that Republicans have been making whenever the Democrats have tried to do anything? Isn't that the reason why Merrick Garland is not on the United States Supreme Court? Really? Republicans might be hypocrites? They might just be full of shit? No, I don't believe that. That can't possibly be true. No, they're going to ram this through real quick before anyone reads it and before anyone gets a chance to say, I'm not voting for that. What can you do? Do it quickly. Go to TrumpTaxScam.org or many other places that are available on the web, TrumpTaxScam.org. Register your complaints. Find out what you can do to get other people to register their complaints. Scare the crap out of Susan Collins and maybe John McCain or one or two other senators who might be on the fence. Let's talk for a minute about Donald Trump being a jackass and having no idea what the hell's going on in his own administration. Donald Trump is describing the tax bill as, quote, economic rocket fuel. What's wrong with economic rocket fuel? Well, for people who didn't fail Macroeconomics 101, the Federal Reserve right now is busy raising interest rates and debating how much they're going to have to raise them in the future. What happens here? Our economy tries to walk a fine line between being too dead, leading to too much unemployment, recession, not enough economic activity, and too lively, meaning inflation, overheated economy. It is the job of our presidential administration, our Congress, and the Federal Reserve Bank to try to keep us fine-tuned within a reasonable range. The Federal Reserve kept interest rates ridiculously low for a while to stimulate the economy, because lower interest rates stimulate economic activity. There. Now you know everything you need to know about macroeconomics. But now the Federal Reserve is looking and saying our economy appears to have bounced back. We've been growing. Unemployment is way down to the point where we don't actually want it to go down further, too inflationary. So the Federal Reserve is saying we need to put the brakes on our economy a little bit. Raise interest rates. We're going to raise them again. We don't know exactly how soon. That's going to depend on the economic numbers. So in other words, when you're worried about a fire spreading, it's not the time to take out the gasoline. This is not a good time to be planting brush in Ventura County. You don't feed those fires that we are trying to quell. That's how our economy works. But that's okay. Republicans can always have it both ways. That's what it means to be a Republican and to speak to Republican voters. Take the tax cuts. One thing we do know about them and the promise of them is that they are going to expire for the middle class in a few years. That's one of the main reasons why the middle class is getting screwed by these tax cuts. That's the only way they can make them fit within it's only going to add $1.5 trillion to the deficit requirement. But the middle class isn't going to be happy with the fact that they're not going to have tax cuts. So don't worry, those tax cuts aren't really going to be eliminated. But wait a minute, then what about the budget deficit? Well, we'll be eliminating those tax cuts and we'll be taking care of the deficit. But wait a minute, what about the middle class? Well, we won't be eliminating those tax cuts. Doesn't matter. You have it both ways. Just heard an interesting statistic on one of my podcasts. The DeVos family itself, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, her brother, the private militia, Eric Prince, and their family will save about $2 billion from the estate tax cut alone, which is about equal to the savings that we're going to realize from making teachers not only pay for their own supplies for their students, but not be able to write it off their taxes. That seems like a good idea. Susan Collins, remember, she held her nose and voted for the tax bill because the Republicans had promised her that they would protect Medicare and Medicaid in her state because a lot of her citizens, Maine citizens, are on Medicare and Medicaid. While they were still making the promise, they were busy saying, we can't afford Medicare and Medicaid, there are going to have to be cuts. Literally, they're saying to her, we are going to preserve Medicare and Medicaid. We've got to cut Medicare and Medicaid. It's going to happen. Don't worry, Susan, we are going to protect Medicare and Medicaid. It's being cut, people. It is gone. Where are you, Susan Collins? Are you that stupid or are you that full of shit? Come clean to your constituents. I don't give a shit about your health care. My donors require tax cuts for billionaires. Yes, we in America are the religious extremists. Extremists, religious or otherwise. Some people might not have been happy with my comparison of extremist Republican voters to ISIS. When you have the budget director talking about MAGAnomics to justify the tax bill, MAGAnomics, Make America Great Again-nomics. Your policy, your rationale for a multi-trillion-dollar change to the U.S. economy is something that could fit on a bumper sticker? That's where we are? Deficit hypocrites? People ask. They're not really deficit hypocrites. Republicans are consistent. The deficit only matters when the deficit is the result of spending money, especially if it's spending money on poor people. When the deficit results from tax cuts for rich people, we're cool with that. It's the starve the beast. We don't have any money. Rich people have too much. Broadcom is returning to the United States. Remember, there was a big photo op with President Trump, and the CEO of Broadcom kissed his ass like he was a member of the Trump cabinet. Oh, thank you, Mr. President. We're bringing our headquarters back to America because of the wonderful thing you are doing for the U.S. economy and how you're making us great again. Turns out, you know why Broadcom's coming back to the United States? Not to hire people, to buy out one of its competitors in a hostile takeover. Broadcom figured that if they were a foreign company, there would be a hard time getting approval for a hostile takeover as a foreign company. So they came to America so they could use all their profits to buy a rival. If we give them more money, which we are planning on doing, you know what they're going to do? They're going to buy another rival. They're still not going to invest in America. It's all bullshit, because that's not the way it works. Why might this work for the Republicans? This blatant screwing of the American public, which is being described across our land as an achievement. It's the Republicans' only achievement. It's a piece of shit, but at least they did something. That's the way they're going to describe it. Look what we did. Don't look at the details. We did something. Also, works for John Wilkes Booth. We'll talk more about how Republicans are planning to use the info wars and deception and bullshit media to get away with continually ripping off the American public, including in the current tax bill, when we see you next week. In the meantime, thank you for joining us. Like Looking Forward, go to forwardnationradio.com. That's forwardnationradio.com and get the full experience. You'll see the video from this and every episode there and on our YouTube channel as well. Don't miss the next Forward Nation Radio podcast on Podbean at podbean.com. If you love what you heard, like what you heard, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, tell your friends, help us spread the word. Thanks to all of our interns. Thanks to our viewers. See you next week.
You've been listening to Forward Nation Radio with David Leventhal.